What does genius mean to me? I think a genius is not just answering questions, but asking questions that nobody else thought to ask.
There's a particular thing that happens to you when you watch people do something that they're really, really good at. You kind of know whenever you witness somebody being really, really excellent at something. It's a profound experience to be able to be around it.
Most people agree that whoever the geniuses are, and you could say it's the people that can combine ideas that are staring everyone else in the face, but they somehow connect something that no one's even thought about.
The most elegant answer to the question of what is a genius was given to me by Ron Howard. Some scientists operate at the edge of the light where the dark is, which nobody knows what's in the dark. But a tiny number of scientists jump right into the dark and create their own light around them.
That was part of a teaser for a TV series on the life of Albert Einstein, simply titled Genius. But on this program, we'll be highlighting the genius of another historical figure whose name is known around the world. In fact, according to many scholars, he's the most famous teacher who ever lived. On this edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast, I'll be talking with Peter J. Williams about the surprising genius of Jesus.
Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm Shane Rosenthal, and my guest for this program is Peter J. Williams, who is the principal of Tyndale House, Cambridge, and the author of Can We Trust the Gospels? More recently, he's written a book that I like so much, I've ended up purchasing additional copies to give away as gifts. The book is titled The Surprising Genius of Jesus, which is the primary focus of our conversation for this episode. Toward the end of our conversation, I also decided to ask Dr. Williams a few questions related to the date of the fourth gospel, particularly in light of recent trends among New Testament scholars. In fact, one might even be tempted to call these new trends a paradigm shift. More and more scholars, it seems, are coming to the conclusion that the Gospel of John was written before the fall of Jerusalem. Now, with regard to his book on the surprising genius of Jesus, Dr. Williams makes the point that though more people claim to follow the teachings of Jesus than any other person in history, surprisingly, the word genius is rarely applied to him. So I began my conversation by asking why he thought this was.
Well, I think often we see Jesus through a very religious lens, and obviously Christians believe he's the Son of God, he's God himself, therefore he knows everything. So you wouldn't normally call God a genius.
Right.
It can seem a little bit understating. In a sense, it's saying too little. The particular point I'm trying to make is that he has left magisterial artwork, and that, in a sense, just from a sort of engaging with secular discourse point of view, I want to point that out. So just as Mozart has his symphonies and so on, we have this sort of stuff from Jesus, demonstrably from Jesus. And I think that's a key thing.
One of the things you point out throughout your book is that when you read through Jesus' stories and parables from all four Gospels, it becomes clear that this material is the product of one mind, rather than, say, a committee of later Christians who are publishing stories that they're attributing to Jesus.
Yep.
Why are you convinced of that?
Well, part of it is the simplicity of the explanation. So you've got to think, how many geniuses do you want? So it's not just that you have stories, you also have sayings, one-liners. So you could think of the truth will set you free is a phrase that's only in John. And Jesus has loads of them, like love your enemies. No one ever documented as saying anything like that before him. So it's a completely original invention. And you have lots of these sort of sayings from Jesus, and they're spread across Gospels. They're not just in one thing. Now, obviously, the parables are just in the first three Gospels. But again, Jesus's wisdom is there across all four. And then you also see certain patterns, images recurring. So parables begin and end in different Gospels, often the same way. The care, the contrasts. There's more in terms of the cultural background. So when Jesus is using particular numbers and measures in his Gospels, he's using ones that come from his land. And there's a reliance on the Old Testament. There's a deep way that he interacts with the Old Testament, which is running through lots of different stories. So again, it seems to be one mind.
The primary example you work with in your book is the parable of the prodigal son from Luke 15, which you say follows two other parables which basically serve as warm-up acts. Talk about that.
Yeah. So what we've got in Luke 15 is we've got the story of the lost sheep, 1 out of 100 sheep lost coin, 1 out of 10 coins lost. You could argue the next number you're expecting is a sort of 100%. And the sheep is lost by going away from home. The coin is lost at home. And then we got a story of two brothers, one who goes away from home and is lost, and then another brother who's at home. And it doesn't say he's lost, but Jesus is using a sort of Sudoku principle where you use the things supplied to fill in what's not. So as you can see in Jesus' final story of the two sons, there's a missing ending. You're never told how the older brother responds, but we know how we could fill in the ending if he responds well, because there's rejoicing about the sheep lost away from home. There's rejoicing about the coin at home. There's rejoicing about the younger son coming back home. So we know how we could fill in that ending. And those are sort of vital ways that Jesus is putting these three stories together.
Yeah, so it's all about the context. There's celebration in all the parables, and the question is, will the people who are targeted in the parable, the subject of the parable, will they come to the party or not?
Totally, yeah. And I think also Jesus' story, that final story of the two sons, has two audiences simultaneous, and this is part of the genius of it. It says at the beginning of Luke 15, he's talking to tax collectors and sinners. You don't expect them to know the Bible or care about the Bible much. And then on the other hand, you've got scribes who copy out the Bible, Pharisees who spend their time trying to follow the Bible. And those two groups each are targeted. And that's just an amazing thing. I mean, anyone who can speak to two contrasting groups simultaneously in effective ways, that's just incredible.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about that setting. Like, what happened in Luke 15 that inspired these three parables, or this one parable told in three different successive ways?
Yeah, so it says that tax collectors and sinners are drawing near to him. So that's the key thing. And if you're a Pharisee, you resent the fact that you have to pay taxes to Rome Incorporated through the tax collectors. I mean, that's money you could have donated to the temple, and that guy just ripped you off of some tax last week. So you're pretty annoyed at them. And then the thought that they can come close to a rabbi and get accepted, not pushed away, that's a bit problematic. And as for the sinners, I mean, they have to be people who are everyone's a sinner at one sense, but to get this as your label, that has to be
something notorious.
Yeah, a core part of your identity, that you are in flagrant breach either of the Old Testament or of the laws that people have added to that. That's the polar opposite of a Pharisee. A Pharisee is someone who doesn't breach that stuff. They spend their time separating from breaches. That's what Pharisee means. So the Pharisees are the good guys, the sinners are the bad guys. And yet, how can these bad guys, sinners and tax collectors, get close to God through Jesus? That's scandalous. And then Jesus tells this parable to them. And at one level, I could say, yeah, he's aiming at the scribes and Pharisees, but there's still this thing that the majority of the story is about the younger son. When you introduced it at the beginning, you talked about the parable of the prodigal son. That's how it's become known, because that is the bigger bit of the story. And I think there is something that's consistent through the Gospels about those who are well don't need a doctor. Jesus's ministry is more aimed at those who are outside than at those who are inside. So although I often call it the story of the two sons, if I had to call it the parable of the prodigal son, I'm happy with that. That's still the more important of the two bits of the story, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way people know the story. But I think you're right that it is the story of two lost sons. They're prodigals in different ways. One's lost away, the other's lost at home.
Yeah, and in recent years, there's been a sort of readjusting to emphasize more towards the end of the story, the older son. And of course, that's the climax. It's the missing ending, all that sort of stuff. So I'm all for that readjustment, but I just don't want to lose sight of that open-armed welcome, which is the picture which you come away with. That's what Rembrandt's going to picture.
Right.
Not that that's all he pictures, but that's the thing that most sticks in your mind. And that's okay.
You highlight the fact that the scribes and Pharisees were grumbling. Why is that significant?
Well, of course, grumbling is a famous Old Testament theme. It's what Israel does in the desert. And it also says the tax collectors and sinners are coming to hear him. And that word is a very key word. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, hear, O Israel, and the Lord your God, the Lord is one. It's the command you're meant to think of every day. And the bad guys are hearing and the good guys are grumbling. So there's a sort of reversal going on already there in the narrative. And that is then reflected in the story that Jesus tells as well.
Do you think that role reversals is one of the key aspects of all of Jesus' parables? I mean, if you think of like Luke 18, the tax collector and the Pharisee, you expect the Pharisee praying at the temple is the good guy, just like you were saying. And yet it's the tax collector who goes home justified. And that's shocking, really, in its first century audience, isn't it?
Yeah, so there is lots of role reversal. The Good Samaritan's another example.
Mm-hmm.
There are some cases which aren't so much like that. Let's say one person is trusted 5 talents, 1, 2, 1, 1, and the one who has 5 ends up gaining 5 more, and the one who has 1 doesn't. So I think that you can have different ways these parables work, but role reversal is a regular theme in Jesus' teaching, and also it's a theme of Luke's gospel, but it is also outside Luke's gospel, and that's the key point. It's not something that just Luke invented. Luke makes it a theme of his gospel because of Jesus' role reversal, and there's no bigger role reversal than the King of Heaven going to the cross.
Yeah.
So it's something Jesus lived and died.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of reminded of the shocking nature of Jesus stooping down and washing his disciples' feet. And Peter saying, no, you will not wash my feet.
Yeah.
And then they had no idea of how much further he would descend into humiliation the next day.
Yeah, so the role reversal is there everywhere that you mentioned from John's gospel, but you can have that with the humble birth in Bethlehem, in Matthew and so on. So yeah, you can get it everywhere.
Yeah. Over and over again, you point out that one of the best ways to see the depth of Jesus' insight is by comprehending his frequent allusions to the Old Testament. So in the opening of the parable of Luke 15, he describes himself as a shepherd who searches out for lost sheep. And in John 10, he says more explicitly, I am the good shepherd who gives his life for the sheep. But this shepherd imagery, I mean, it's all over the place in the Old Testament. You find it in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, or Ezekiel 34, where Yahweh himself says, I will become the shepherd of the sheep.
Yeah.
In the midst of all the false shepherds. In other words, the more you understand the Old Testament passages that Jesus is alluding to, the more you begin to understand what Jesus is actually claiming about himself. This is no ordinary rabbi.
Absolutely. And I think that's implicit in a lot of what Jesus says. Likewise, with when he says, I have come, he means I have come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Not I just come from Nazareth. I've come into the world to do this. He exists before he comes into the world.
Like he told Nicodemus, no one ascends into heaven except for he who descended from heaven.
Exactly. So, yeah, this is a frequent theme, and the shepherd is an amazing image used of God, and Christ takes it up of himself. Yeah.
There's a brief line at the end of John 1 in which Jesus says to Nathanael, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And, as you read that without knowing the story of Genesis, you end up missing the profundity of that statement. But would you agree that Jesus there is essentially claiming to be the very one who appeared to Jacob on that great stairway leading to heaven in Genesis 28?
Yes. And I mean, even if you didn't accept it from that one passage, it's the fact that there's a pattern of things where Jesus claims to be what the Old Testament is pointing to. So it's not just one where perhaps if it was one, we could say, well, he's just saying he's like the ladder, but then it's just coming up so much that he is the temple, he's the sacrifice, he's the priest, everything is coming through. So I think the ladder in Genesis 28 really just points to Jesus. It's a prefiguring of him. He is the one who joins heaven and earth.
Yeah, and sometimes he's not just prefigured, he's the one there in Genesis doing the prefiguring.
Sure, yeah.
So here's the way that Jesus introduces the final parable of Luke 15. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. In your book, you say that by his actions, the younger son has essentially renounced his family and publicly shamed his father. Why do you say that?
I mean, normally in any culture, you don't go to your dad and ask for inheritance ahead of time.
Yeah, he hasn't died yet.
He hasn't died yet. So as far as we can tell from any cultural comparison, this is a matter of shame. And then, of course, not long afterwards, he goes away. But the key thing that people miss in the story is that the father gives the property to them both. And that really is where the older brother should be amazingly grateful, because he's just landed the jackpot because his little brother asked the awkward question. So all this resentment you see later in the story from the older brother towards his younger brother, it should be the opposite. From this point onwards, the older brother owns the farm. When he claims to his dad, you never gave me a young goat, the truth is he gave him every goat on the farm. Because the older brother says, you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. And the point is, he wants to have a celebration away from his dad. So there, I think there's actually a closer relationship between the younger son and the father than between the older son and the father. And that's why every single time in this story, when the younger son talks to or about his father, he uses the word father. 5 times he uses the word father. And the very first word from the older son's mouth is, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. So in other words, it's the absence of a word, which is part of Jesus's genius in storytelling, to show you the older brother is physically close but emotionally more distant than the son who is physically distant but emotionally closer.
Yeah. The younger son then journeys to a far country. He squanders his money and begins to go hungry as a result of a great famine. So he hired himself out and got a job caring for pigs. Now, you cite a line from the Jewish Talmud which says, cursed is the one who raises pigs. So this wasn't seen as a particularly noble calling in the eyes of Jesus' hearers, right?
No, I mean, I think I want to start with shepherding. Shepherding's already the lowest of the lowest, pretty boring job, not necessarily very high skill. That's why you're going to give it to the younger brother, David, of Jesse's big family. But then you combine that with uncleanness, which you've got with a pig. And then it becomes a really, just the lowest and uncleanest job you can imagine. And at this point, also, Jesus has really got the Pharisees on side, because if you just go through the story to this point, they think it's going well. This guy is getting what he deserves. He set off with all that money and now he is looking after pigs. And if the story had ended and, he died starving, but having fed pigs, the Pharisees would have said that was a good story. It worked out as it should have done.
So eventually he decides that he'd be better off as a servant back at home and begins to go over in his mind what he'll say to his father. You point out that, if you compare the speech that he's sort of rehearsing in his mind with what he actually says, he only gets halfway through before the father sort of interrupts him.
Yeah.
There's no talk of him becoming a servant. He actually is just immediately, the father has compassion and then restores him to sonship without any of the groveling.
Yes. So he never gets to the bit, make me like one of your hired servants. But I think the father interrupts him because the father's in a huge rush. Very first word from the father's mouth is the word quick. So he's running and he's saying quick. So speed is of the essence. And again, good storytelling that Jesus doesn't slow the story down to tell you, and the father interrupted, nor does he, present the father as an interrupting father. It's simply that you're carried through with the actual words. And the father never actually talks to the younger son in the whole story. That's surprising. Not a single word, but he doesn't need to. He has said his love with actions. His running, his calling for the robe, the fatted calf, his joy, and he wants him to have a ring as well. So he's sort of re-empowering him. All of that tells you everything you need to know. And he doesn't ask him, hey, what did you do on that money? What were you doing? What were you up to? So it's actually ideal.
So after teaching the parables in a few different settings, I began to notice, one or two connections between Luke 15 and some of the stories recorded in Genesis. But when I read your book, I realized that I'd hardly scratched the surface. I mean, talk for a minute about some of these parallels that exist between this parable and the story, for example, of Jacob and Esau.
Yeah, so I mean, this is really where we get to the heart of where I think there's genius that hasn't been seen. The story of the two sons is about 3 minutes long when you read it or recite it out loud. It's not a long story. And yet I would argue it has references to all of Genesis's greatest hits. So if you start with just the opening words, a man had two sons, I find that can trigger three lots of characters in the Old Testament. The most famous person to have two and only two sons is Isaac. And of course, he's got the younger son, Jacob, who tricks the older son, Esau, out of his inheritance. Therefore, older brother is mad, angry, and he goes off to a far country. And the funny thing is, when he comes back, you're expecting him to get splatted by Esau, who's coming towards him with 400 men.
Yep.
And then it says Esau ran, embraced, and kissed him. And it's the only time in the Old Testament you get that phrase. And that's striking to any scribe because they count phrases really carefully. And so the climax of Jesus' story tells you it was the father, not the older brother, who came and welcomed him. Even though bad old Esau in the Old Testament had been tricked out of everything, he welcomed his younger brother. And there are lots of other references to that story as well. But a man had two sons can also remind you of Abraham, who had two sons. And Abraham's the only one who gives away his inheritance while he's still alive. And he gives it all to Isaac, not to Ishmael. Ishmael loses inheritance in Genesis chapter 21 when he despises the feast given in honor of his younger brother. Again, there's a message there. And it links with Abraham because Abraham's the first guy to run. He's an old guy when he runs. The very first word from his mouth in Genesis 18 when he runs is the word quick. He then gets the fatted calf, the Bible's first fatted calf. That's a clear reference. And then a man had two sons also reminds you of Adam, who has two sons. Yes, he has some more later. And now the older son is envious at the acceptance of the younger brother. There's this correspondence or this dialogue between Cain and God, just like there is between the father and the older brother in this case. So a lot of that is in Jesus' story. And that's just triggered off the first phrase of Jesus' story, a man had two sons. And then you see the details worked out. I could keep going on.
Well, it's amazing that in all the examples you gave, there's a role reversal between the older brother and the younger brother. So Cain is the older brother. Ishmael was the firstborn son, the oldest. Esau is the older brother, and in Jesus' parable, it's the older brother who's the grumbling one, the one who is, the focus of the parable, who kind of mirrors the grumbling nature of the Pharisees. And that's not an accident, is it?
No, so that's this theme you have running throughout the Bible of God taking the younger brother often and favoring them. You get it in the case of David. Now, of course, it's not a rule because Jesus is an older brother. Theologically, he's an older brother in the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, but also in terms of the Holy Family. He's Mary's firstborn, and that's really important.
But like Esau, he is the older brother who ends up being cursed so that we can be blessed.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so that you can look at it that way. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I noticed about that Jacob and Esau story is that Jacob was blessed at Esau's expense. He's the schemer. He's dressed up in the garments of the firstborn, and it's on that basis that he was blessed and given the fertile land of Canaan as an inheritance. And the more I thought about that as I was teaching through that book, the more it just struck me that that's an odd way to craft a mythological story about, Israel's founding patriarch. He schemed his way, and then that's how he gets Canaan.
Yeah.
Like, why would you make the story up that way?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, don't come out that well. Almost your first scene is Abraham pimping his wife, which is not great for the father of nations and so on. And there's plenty more.
And that happens a couple of times, and also with Isaac.
Yeah. So what do we know about Isaac? Incredibly passive figure, blesses the wrong son, at least, not the son he was intending to, and, presents his wife as if she's his sister. There's not a lot of positive role model in Isaac. There is some, but not a lot. And so the thing that comes through for me as I read Genesis is just God's grace.
Yeah.
Using fallen sinners. There are positive things that we can emulate about these people, but even more overwhelming is just seeing God's kindness amidst sin.
I often think of it as like not just foreshadowing, but different variations on a theme where the way you highlight the different allusions, Jesus is alluding to these Old Testament themes, little pieces of the story that sort of remind you of how it was told before in a different way maybe, but is kind of thrown alongside. That's the very meaning of the word parable, thrown alongside with the present reality. So when you realize that the story of Jacob and Esau foreshadows the story of our ultimate redemption, that none of us inherits the promised land unless we're clothed in the garments of the firstborn of all creation, then things start to make sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it all fits together, amazing, really.
You also highlight a few of the parallels that exist between Luke 15 and the story of Joseph.
Yeah, so I mean, the most obvious ones are the sudden ring and the robe. So that's what's given to the younger son. And that just, again, it's Genesis 41, 42, where you get that suddenly given to Joseph coming out of prison before Pharaoh. But of course, there's more because it's at a time of great famine. That's a key thing. And there is some reversal there because you have Judah, an older brother to Joseph, actually says he's willing to be a servant to rescue his younger brother Benjamin. But if you wind back in the story of Judah, you've got this amazing paneling of Genesis 38 and 39. So Genesis 38 is the X-rated chapter about Judah and Tamar, where Judah, from whom the Jews derive their name, is sexually misbehaving in the land, while in Genesis 39, his little brother Joseph is resisting Mrs. Potiphar in a far country. Now, when you think that at the end of Jesus' story, you've got this self-righteous older brother saying, this son of yours who's wasted your livelihood with prostitutes. Well, hang on. How does he have a clue what his brother's done? He's not even, he's just in from the field. The younger brother hasn't been communicating with anyone. That's just his imagination. So I think you see these sort of echoes of the Joseph story. Also, there's a contrast where no one gives the younger brother anything, but Joseph feeds everyone.
Right.
So again, the reaction in the famine is just the opposite. And you see often this is the way Jesus is using material from the Old Testament. It's just to turn it absolutely on its head.
And, he's the son who was despised by his brothers, left for dead, thrown in a pit, and yet at the end of the story, he's at the right hand of the Most High in the land.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wearing the splendid garment and then causing a great redemption. But the fact is, in this case, there's a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament that are told in different ways, just like the book of Hebrews says. But in this case, it's kind of like the story of Jesus written in advance, but written on the stage of history. This is a historical narrative.
Yes, and then another cycle we haven't really picked up on is Jacob and Laban. So all these years I've been working for you, which is a phrase that the older brother used, slaving for you. And that is said at a point of anger. Well, that sounds incredibly similar to what Jacob says to his father-in-law, Laban. And at that same point, you have a number of reversals and connections with Jesus' story, where Laban says, all that you see is mine. The father says, all that I have is yours. So you got these sorts of quite subtle reversals. And if they were just on their own, you wouldn't necessarily think there's a significance to them. But once you've already established that an author is referencing parts across Genesis, then the actual threshold for being convinced an extra little detail is a deliberate reference is actually far lower in probability terms. So that's where I think if Genesis is about 4 hours worth of text as you read it out loud, what's amazing to me is that Jesus winds in bits from all of the major story cycles of Genesis into this 3-minute story, so that there is a really clear reference about, let's say, every 20 seconds in the story, as well as lots of other bits which are more subtle, or maybe a reversal or a parallel. But the interesting thing is there, how can you do that so that the story is not weighed down by those? So it's not messed up by those. It's not that there's someone sort of created a sentence out of cuttings of other sentences. It's actually a really smooth, coherent, emotionally effective work of art.
Yeah.
And you know, who's the artist who's able to do that? Well, it's the one who created language himself, created the universe, was sovereign over the stories of Genesis. That's why he can make the work of art. You know, it's the one who created the stars, created this story.
Yeah. It's both theology and apologetics at the same time, because you see, this is beautiful, and it's the story of Jesus in advance, but it's also, who else could do this?
Yeah, so I do think that beauty is a key thing. Apologetics, aesthetics is a key part of apologetics. I mean, just to give you an analogy, when there was the Copernican revolution and people switched to Copernicus's system, it was just so much more beautiful than anything else. In one sense, the hard data to back up Copernicus comes a little bit later, but just the simplicity of, you know, little stuff goes around big stuff. I can summarize it like that, and suddenly everything fits in. That works well. And so there's just this simplicity with Jesus that it's a work of art, and that's just astounding.
That's what some people say about, like, the Gospel of John. It's simple enough for a child to understand, and yet profound that you can't really wrap your mind around some of the concepts, even if you read it for your entire life.
Yeah, and I think also with the life of Jesus, where, again, we can do sort of historical apologetics a certain amount. We can show bits of Tacitus or whatever, certain things that correlate with the New Testament, but most of it we can't. And yet you ask yourself the question, who could make this up? How could it be made up? And you realize pretty soon it's impossible to make up something of this beauty, this scope. I mean, because you have stories embedded within Jesus' story, and it's what we're talking about. Not just the story of Jesus, but the fact that he pauses every now and then and tells you a story. So it's more than sort of the way sometimes, J.K. Rowling will do this. The Deathly Hallows will have the little story within her story, Tales of Beedle and the Bard, whatever. But what Jesus is doing is just on steroids in terms of, here we have a 3-minute story, which is just like we find with cells and atoms and so on. And you could just go in further and further and see more and more detail as you go in. I know some AI have managed to generate this, where you get these pictures where the more you drill in, the more you see, as a sort of infinite regress. Well, I think you've got that with Jesus' story, and that's really impressive.
And that's not a bad way to introduce people to the story of Jesus. Just consider it really profound and beautiful literature, and then to have the person be captivated by that story. Sure. And then along the way, you throw in, by the way, this is better explained if it's real history, not just a committee making up the parable.
Yeah.
One of the things you point out in your book related to the Jacob and Esau story is the significance of that line, and he kissed him. This is from the Genesis story, I think in Genesis 32 or 33 maybe?
33 verse 4.
Yeah, 33 verse 4. So you've got it memorized. I thought that was a really interesting point that you made, because that's an unexpected thing for Esau to forgive his brother. He's been disinherited because of Jacob's deception, and yet Esau forgives, hugs, and kisses his brother. You know, the whole previous night, Jacob was afraid that he was going to be attacked by his brother. And here he is hugging and kissing him. And what that does, as Jesus kind of alludes to that, he's sort of saying to the grumbling Pharisees who are grumbling at their younger brothers, and they're not willing to forgive, look how much better Esau was. And Jesus is basically aligning himself with Esau as the forgiving elder brother. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I think that's a surprising alignment. And the story itself is the most surprising one in the entire Old Testament, because the whole chapter before, you've been told Jacob knows Esau's coming towards him with 400 armed men. Then it tells you how he's splitting up his family into different groups so that if Esau gets one group, he doesn't get the others. So you know that Jacob is absolutely petrified. So you're not expecting this to end well. If you're doing this for the very first time, you're reading it for the first time. And so to have a bad old Esau, who, by the way, earlier wanted to kill Jacob before he even went away.
Yeah, that's why he left the land.
Yeah, so suddenly running, embracing, and kissing him. This is astounding. You're not expecting it. And so Jesus picks up on that with the grace of God, who's like the father in Jesus' story, is as surprising as that.
Yeah. You also discuss a number of other stories told by Jesus. One that you alluded to already, the parable of leaven from Luke 13, which says, "The kingdom of God is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 seahs of flour until it was all leavened." That seahs language is sometimes not translated in English. That's what it is in the Greek. In English, mostly it just reads measures, I think, most of the time.
Nowadays, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think older translations often used to say seah or something like that.
What Old Testament story, in your opinion, is Jesus alluding to here?
So for me, it's very clear that it's Genesis chapter 18, which is the first home catering in the Bible. So there's Abraham sitting and sees 3 men, and he runs, kills a fatted calf, and he gets his wife, Sarah, to produce 3 seahs of flour, which is an awful lot of flour. I mean, that's a massive amount. I mean, it could be north of 30 pounds or more of flour, a really large amount for 3 people.
That's a feast, yeah.
So you've got in Jesus' story that the father runs, the first word is quick, and then there's a fatted calf. Those are all firsts in the Bible. If you're a scribe, it's the first time you copy the word run, first time you see the word quick, first time you copy calf. But in between those, it says, Abraham said to Sarah, quick, 3 seahs of flour. There's not even a verb. And then he goes and gets the fatted calf. Now, seahs occur on other occasions in the Bible, but never 3 and never with flour. And this is with a woman. So it's woman, 3 seah. And I think it's pretty clear that that gives you some meaning to Jesus's shortest parable. What Jesus is doing is he's giving you this sort of reference, allusion to the Old Testament that, look, at that time, Sarah had no physical or spiritual children. The kingdom of heaven is like that, like a woman. And she starts off with nothing, and then it just grows and grows and grows. And so that's, in a sense, God honoring her home baking, making her then the mother, physically and spiritually, of more people than you can count.
And according to verse 1 of Genesis 18, the Lord appeared, Yahweh appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. So he was one of the 3.
Oh, totally, yeah.
And Abraham then says, let a little water be brought to wash your feet. So this is a physical manifestation of Yahweh.
Oh, totally, yeah.
According to John, no one has ever seen God, the one who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Paul says something similar. Jesus is the image of the invisible God.
Yeah.
All this guides my interpretation of Genesis 18, which I then interpret as a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Do you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree.
So then what you have is Jesus in his pre-incarnate state giving one of the first promises. I mean, this is where he announces the birth of Isaac, essentially.
Yep.
So that connects us to the very beginning of Israel's history when the promissorial leaven was being hidden in the Abrahamic dough.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the way I'd see these things being treated is, I mean, it's not always a one-to-one sort of correspondence from the symbolism of the Old Testament. God makes so many promises to Abraham, I haven't quite counted them, and they're slightly ratcheting up each time.
Yeah, and the idea of Jesus' parable, the leavening the whole loaf, matches with a lot of other imagery. The rock cut from no human hand that fills the earth. Or even here, the promise given to Sarah that you're going to have a miraculous birth.
Yeah.
You're in your 90s, but you're going to have a child. And this is the beginning of this expansion of the Israelites, which grows miraculously. You see that from the time of Abraham through the Exodus, that they have this incredible fertility that creates this new nation out of nothing.
Yes. And I mean, a nice thing in this shortest ever parable of Jesus is it occurs in Matthew 13 and in Luke 13. In each case, it occurs in a pair. So there's a pair of them. It's the parable of the grain of mustard seed, immediately followed by this. Now, one is, we know this is a feature of Jesus' teaching to use a male and a female pair. So as we see with the male shepherd loses one of the 100 sheep, the woman then who has lost a coin. And it's exactly the same thing that you get with this pair. So This is Luke 13, verse 18 to 20. What's the kingdom of God like? To what shall I compare it? It's like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his garden, and it grew and became a tree, and the birds of the air made nests in its branches. And again he said, to what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It's like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So it's a man and a woman, and in each case it's a story of growth. The mustard seed is tiny and it grows to be this tree. Leaven is tiny and again it grows up. And in each case it's got an allusion to the Old Testament. So the birds of heaven nesting in the trees, that's a reference to Daniel, and how there's this great tree like the kingdom, and the birds nest in that.
Yeah.
And then that makes a good case that what you've got going on with the parable of the leaven is, again, this reference to the Old Testament, the reference to what Sarah does. So it's really good to see that pairing together, just a feature of Jesus' teaching.
On last week's program, I released an interview that I recorded with Peter J. Williams a few years ago related to his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? And before I concluded my conversation with him this time around, I decided to ask a few questions related to the dating of the fourth gospel in light of recent trends. Less than a century ago, it wasn't uncommon to find New Testament scholars dating John's gospel in the mid to late 2nd century. But things took a dramatic turn in 1935 with the discovery of the famous John Rylands fragment, which forced even the likes of Rudolf Bultmann to concede that John must have been written in the latter part of the 1st century. Until recently, most New Testament scholars around the world agreed with this late 1st century date. However, at present, things appear to be changing. For example, in his 2019 book, Jesus Mirrored in John, Princeton scholar James Charlesworth writes this: John is not a late composition. I am convinced that the earliest edition of John may antedate 70 CE. Why? It is because the author knew Jerusalem intimately, providing many architectural details which only 30 years ago we imagined were literary inventions. All the reasons that require a late date for the Gospel of John have vanished. Is it possible then to observe a paradigm shift, he asks? And the answer he gives is a confident yes. John Dixon, the Australian historian and host of the Undeceptions podcast, has also indicated that he's reconsidering the date of the fourth gospel, and N.T. Wright recently had this to say.
I have no problem with that. If John is written in the 90s, John is written in the 90s. But I just note that the current Lady Margaret Professor of New Testament in Cambridge, George Van Coten, is arguing in his new book on John for a much, much earlier date, a date I think maybe even in the 40s or certainly the 50s. And I would say, actually, you don't have to wait a long time to get deep theological reflection. You know, the highest Christology in the New Testament is probably Philippians 2, 6-11, which may well be a poem that's already written before Philippians, in other words, in the late 40s or early 50s. So theological development doesn't take place on a slow chronological line. It takes place in leaps and bounds, and it's quite possible that actually the traditional dating of the Gospels in scholarship, which has a late John, may well be wrong.
Richard Bauckham recently noted that he was reconsidering the date of the Synoptic Gospels. Quote, in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, I accepted the most common dating of the Gospels. Nowadays, I'm toying with a date for Mark in the 40s and Luke and Matthew before 66. Like N.T. Wright, Richard Bauckham argues that the work of Cambridge professor George Van Coten has got him thinking about the date of the fourth Gospel as well. Quote, everyone in the patristic period who said anything about it agreed that John was the last of the four Gospels, written very late in the 1st century. I saw no reason not to accept the late date until George Van Coten produced his argument about John 5:2. John 5:2, of course, is the famous passage in which the narrator uses the present tense language to describe Jerusalem, saying, quote, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In my opinion, this is like someone today saying there is in New York a place called the World Trade Center with twin towers. The present tense language doesn't make any sense after 2001, but would fit perfectly if it was written before the 9/11 attacks. A few years ago, I discussed the implications of John 5:2 with New Testament scholar Daniel Wallace, and you can find a link to that episode in the show notes. Well, John 5:2 also comes up in this concluding part of my conversation with Peter J. Williams, and he too highlights the recent work of Cambridge professor George Van Coten.
I think that consensuses of any kind in the academy have sort of vanished because that's no longer the sort of world we live in. So that's worth observing, just that there is what we call a dissolution sometimes of consensus. But the professor of New Testament in Cambridge, George Van Coten, is arguing for a pre-70 date for the Gospel of John on some of those same grounds. I think, there's no reason why it has to be later. Whenever the Gospels date from, they are all from people who are either eyewitnesses in the case of Matthew and John, or are close to eyewitnesses, able to talk to them, as in the case of Luke. And, Mark can be eyewitness or not, but certainly it's early material.
If you were forced to give a date, where would you kind of put John for yourself?
Oh, no, I really don't generally get forced. There is this thing about him surviving to the reign of Domitian, so he can survive late on, but there's no reason to say that his book then has to be written towards the end of his life. People don't normally do their biggest works at the very end of their life. Yes, it is possible for people to be productive towards the end, but I think these earlier type dates make a lot of sense. Because it says in John chapter 5, there is in Jerusalem this gate, that makes more sense before the year 70, but it doesn't absolutely force my hand on that. And one thing I'm saying more recently is the Gospels are close enough to the events to be true and far enough from the events to be false. You can say that of almost anything. Like someone can lie about what happened yesterday or tell the truth about what happened 100 years ago. So now let's get into the detail and actually investigate. And I think where a lot of scholarly studies go wrong is they assume a very thin band of transmission from Jesus into the Gospels. So there's a common way of looking at things that says, well, Mark's the earliest Gospel, and then Matthew and Luke both have this common source, let's call it Q. And it's almost like there are just these two strands that allow things to get from Jesus' mouth into a Gospel. This is highly implausible. If you look at anyone who's been remotely famous, we all have a shed load of stories about them. Anyone who's been locally famous, you can go to their funeral, let's say, and we all share stories. And two of us might share two similar but different stories, but with the same sort of behavior in them or whatever it is. And this is just what happens. And so what we can say is that all four Gospels present Jesus as repeating himself.
Mm-hmm.
So in Matthew, Jesus says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, more than once. He has the saying about divorce more than once. And you can go through Mark and it's, let the one who has ears to hear more than once. Every single Gospel has Jesus repeating himself within that Gospel. People align a saying in one Gospel and a saying in another Gospel as if they are not just the same type of thing, but said at the same moment. And that's really problematic because over in Matthew, blessed are the poor in spirit. Over in Luke, blessed are you poor. And the question is, which did Jesus say? Or John, I am the vine and I am the true vine. Or I am the door and I am the door of the sheep. He has both within one Gospel. So that's where I don't need to take an either or approach, because one Gospel can be saying what Jesus said 1 minute earlier and another what he said 1 minute later, because it's summarizing teaching. And so once you accept that, it makes more sense. I mean, I'm an itinerant speaker. I reuse material all the time. I notice my friend Bart Ehrman is reusing material all the time with slight variation. And so you might well say, well, did Bart say copies of copies of copies or copies of copies of copies of copies? How many times did he say it? And was he in Dallas or in Atlanta when he said it? Well, the answer is both. He said it in both of those places. And that's just fine. And so just accepting that Jesus is an itinerant speaker, his disciples have heard him say many of these things multiple times. They don't have to memorize everything immediately on the spot. And then it makes more sense of what we got in the Gospels.
Folks, you've been hearing from Peter J. Williams, author of Can We Trust the Gospels and The Surprising Genius of Jesus. As always, for more information about anything you've heard on this program, such as books, articles, and related interviews, simply head to the show notes for this episode. Please also remember that this podcast is listener-supported and that next Tuesday is Giving Tuesday. If you've benefited from this program, please consider making a one-time gift or upgrading to a paid subscription. You can also help by telling friends and family about the Humble Skeptic podcast and by leaving a positive review. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you and your family have a happy Thanksgiving, and I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. What kind of work do you do there at Tyndall House?
So, Tyndall House in Cambridge, England, our north of London, we have one of the world's finest libraries of the Bible. And we are, if you like, a missionary organisation based around a library. So we are a missionary organisation to the academy. We are an evangelical research centre, and we also publish. We've got a magazine, and people should go to tyndallhouse.com, subscribe to our free magazine, and we have an amazing podcast.
What's the name of the podcast?
So just Tyndall House Podcasts.
Tyndall House Podcast.
Yeah. So lots for people to get into, where it's Bible research made accessible to normal people.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Well, it's a real pleasure.
By the way, I've been just handing out as gifts your book on the surprising genius of Jesus, giving it to pastors, because it's like, man, once you sort of tune in to the allusions of Jesus, more than anything, what I'm finding is like the more you find out what he's alluding to, that sort of opens up the way you interpret Genesis and all the other Old Testament texts.
Great. Well, keep doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your work, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you.